For centuries, one population in the Balkans has stood out as a genuine linguistic mystery. Everyone around them speaks a Slavic language. Serbian, Macedonian, Bulgarian, Bosnian, Croatian, all part of the same broad Slavic language family that swept across the region roughly 1,500 years ago. Albanian doesn't belong to that family at all. It sits completely alone, its own separate branch of the Indo-European language tree, unrelated to any of its immediate neighbors, and one of the biggest linguistic puzzles in all of Europe. Linguists sometimes describe Albanian as a language isolate within its own family branch, meaning that while it technically belongs to the broader Indo-European tree, it has no living close relatives anywhere on that tree, no sister language. It can be clearly grouped alongside the way Spanish groups naturally with Italian and French, or the way Russian groups naturally with Polish and Czech. Every other major language spoken in Europe today fits comfortably into one of a handful of well-documented branches: Slavic, Germanic, Romance, Celtic, and a few smaller ones. Albanian sits by itself, an entire branch of one, which is exactly the kind of anomaly that tends to make linguists and geneticists equally curious about where it actually came from. For generations, the obvious assumption followed naturally from that language. A completely unrelated language must mean a completely unrelated people. A population that somehow stayed genetically separate from everyone around it, tracing back to an ancient group that never got absorbed into the wave of Slavic migration that reshaped almost the entire rest of the region, holding out linguistically the same way it must have held out demographically. Then scientists actually sequenced the DNA, and the results did not match the assumption at all, not even close. Stick around, because this one connects language, ancient history, and genetics in a way that genuinely surprised the researchers who ran the numbers, and it might just change how you look at a few other language mysteries too. Subscribe if you want more of this kind of deep dive. Let's start with the language itself, because understanding just how unusual it really is makes the genetic result that follows land with its full weight. Albanian is classified as its own independent branch within the Indo-European language family, on the same organizational level as entire branches like Slavic, Germanic, or Romance. It isn't a dialect of anything. It isn't closely related to any living language spoken today. Linguists have spent well over a century debating exactly where it came from, with the two leading theories pointing toward ancient languages once spoken in the Balkans before the region's Slavic-speaking majority ever arrived, either Illyrian, a language spoken by ancient tribes across the Western Balkans, or Thracian, a related but distinct ancient language spoken further east and south. Neither ancient language survives in enough written material to settle the debate definitively. Modern Albanian is essentially treated as the last surviving descendant of one of these ancient Balkan language families, a linguistic island that somehow survived while everything around it eventually got replaced by Slavic languages arriving from further north and east. The Illyrian hypothesis specifically has long been the more popular of the two theories, partly because the ancient Illyrian tribes are documented by Greek and Roman writers as occupying roughly the same Western Balkan territory where Albanian is spoken today, including areas corresponding to modern Albania, Kosovo, and parts of North Macedonia and Montenegro. This geographic overlap has made the Illyrian connection feel like the more intuitive explanation for over a century of scholarship. The Thracian hypothesis, by contrast, points toward ancient populations documented further east and south, closer to modern Bulgaria and northern Greece, and proponents of this theory argue that certain specific vocabulary and sound patterns in modern Albanian line up more closely with what little is known about ancient Thracian than with what little is known about ancient Illyrian. Because both ancient languages are known today mostly through place names, personal names recorded by Greek and Roman writers, and a small number of inscriptions, rather than through any substantial surviving body of text, linguists have never been able to definitively rule either theory out, and the debate remains genuinely unresolved within historical linguistics even today. Given that history, the reasonable genetic expectation should be obvious. If Albanian really represents an unbroken linguistic survivor from before the Slavic migrations swept through the region, then the population speaking it should show a correspondingly distinct genetic ancestry too, a population that somehow avoided the demographic changes that reshaped the genetic makeup of its Slavic-speaking neighbors during those migrations. That's exactly the assumption researchers went in expecting to test, and that's exactly the assumption the genetic data did not support. Here's what actually happened when researchers compared modern Albanian genomes against other populations across the Balkans. Rather than standing out as a distinct genetic outlier, the way the linguistic evidence might predict, Albanian populations turned out to be remarkably, almost strikingly similar, genetically, to their immediate Slavic-speaking neighbors. Populations in North Macedonia, Serbia, Bosnia, Montenegro, and southern Croatia all showed a genetic ancestry profile broadly overlapping with the Albanian population, far more closely than the enormous linguistic gap between them would suggest. Let that sink in for a second. Two populations, separated by one of the sharpest linguistic divides anywhere in Europe. A population speaking a completely isolated non-Slavic language, living directly alongside populations speaking closely related Slavic languages, and genetically, they look considerably more alike than different. This wasn't one small, isolated study either. Multiple independent genetic surveys across the Balkans, using different sample sets and different statistical methods, kept arriving at broadly the same underlying conclusion. Whatever separates Albanian from its neighbors linguistically, it isn't a correspondingly large genetic separation. It's worth walking through exactly what kind of genetic data researchers actually use to reach this conclusion, since the methodology matters for understanding how confident this finding really is. Researchers collected genome-wide data, meaning hundreds of thousands of genetic markers spread across an individual's entire genome, rather than just a single small region, from Albanian populations both within Albania itself, and from Albanian-speaking communities in Kosovo and North Macedonia, and compared this data against similarly detailed genome-wide data collected from neighboring Slavic-speaking populations across the region, along with Greek populations further south. Using standard population genetics techniques that cluster individuals based on overall genetic similarity, researchers found that Albanian samples did not form their own clearly separated genetic cluster the way a truly distinct, unmixed population would be expected to. Instead, Albanian genomes clustered closely alongside genomes from neighboring populations, overlapping considerably more than the sharp linguistic divide between these communities would predict. So what's actually going on here? What could possibly explain a gap this wide and this consistent? The explanation researchers have converged on connects directly back to something this channel has covered before, in a completely different part of the world. Language and genetic ancestry don't always move together. Sometimes a language spreads across an existing population primarily through cultural transmission, political dominance, or religious conversion, without a matching wave of genetic replacement traveling alongside it. That's very likely what happened across the Balkans during the Slavic migrations, and it flips the entire framing of the Albanian mystery on its head. Rather than asking why Albanians somehow avoided genetic mixing with an incoming Slavic population, the better question turns out to be why the broader Balkan population, genetically, didn't change nearly as much as the language map suggests it should have. Here's the picture that emerges once you follow that logic through. Long before Slavic-speaking groups arrived in the Balkans, sometime around the 6th and 7th centuries of the Common Era, the region was already home to a genetically established population descended from a long, layered history of earlier Balkan inhabitants, including groups connected to the ancient Illyrians and Thracians mentioned earlier, along with populations shaped by centuries of Roman and Byzantine rule across the same territory. When Slavic-speaking groups arrived and eventually became politically and culturally dominant across most of the region, they brought their language with them, and in most areas, that language eventually replaced whatever had been spoken there before. But the genetic evidence increasingly suggests this transition happened primarily through cultural and linguistic assimilation of the existing population, rather than through a population large enough, or demographically dominant enough, to genetically overwhelm the people already living there. Historical estimates of the actual scale of the Slavic migrations into the Balkans have long been debated among historians, and this genetic evidence adds a valuable new data point to that older historical debate. Byzantine sources from the period describe the Slavic migrations in fairly dramatic terms, sometimes suggesting a near-total displacement of the existing Balkan population. But archaeologists have long pointed out that the actual physical evidence for a truly massive population replacement, cities abandoned en masse, entire regions depopulated and then resettled from scratch, is considerably thinner than these dramatic written accounts might suggest. The genetic evidence now emerging fits far more comfortably with the archaeological picture than with the most dramatic version of the historical written accounts, supporting a model where a real and historically significant migration occurred, bringing new political structures, new elites, and crucially, a new dominant language, without that migration necessarily involving enough people to genetically replace the existing, already well-established population across such an enormous stretch of territory. In other words, most of the Balkans switched language without switching population nearly as dramatically as the modern linguistic map implies. The existing Balkan population, genetically speaking, stuck around. It just gradually started speaking Slavic languages instead of whatever it had spoken before. Albanian-speaking communities, under this same framework, represent the one significant pocket across the region where that linguistic transition never fully completed. The population itself, genetically, isn't dramatically different from its Slavic-speaking neighbors, because it descends from largely the same deep Balkan ancestral base. What's different is that, for reasons researchers are still working to fully pin down, this specific community held onto its pre-Slavic language, instead of eventually shifting to Slavic the way most of the rest of the region did. This reframes the entire mystery. It's not really a story about a genetically distinct population that resisted assimilation. It's a story about a broadly shared Balkan population that mostly changed its language, except in one specific pocket that didn't. This naturally raises the next obvious question, one researchers have approached with considerably more caution than the genetic mixing question, simply because the available evidence here is thinner and considerably harder to pin down. Why did this particular linguistic community hold onto its pre-Slavic language when so much of the surrounding region eventually shifted to Slavic instead? Several possible explanations have been proposed, though none has been conclusively proven, and it's likely that more than one factor was involved, rather than a single clean answer. Geography may have played some role since the mountainous terrain of the Western Balkans, particularly across much of modern Albania and Kosovo, has historically made large-scale population movement and administrative control more difficult than in the more open terrain found across much of the rest of the region, potentially allowing communities in these mountainous areas to maintain a degree of relative isolation from the political and cultural centers where Slavic language and administration became dominant. Continuity of local social and religious structures may have also played a role, in a pattern similar to what researchers have documented in other populations that maintained a distinct language despite centuries of surrounding political change, where communities that continued organizing daily life around existing local institutions, rather than fully integrating into a new administrative and cultural system, tended to hold onto their existing language considerably longer than communities that became more thoroughly absorbed into the new political order. This connects to something researchers have documented in several other regions around the world, and it's worth walking through the comparison directly because it makes the Balkan case considerably easier to understand. In Hungary, a population speaking a language completely unrelated to its Indo-European neighbors, part of the Uralic language family instead, turns out to be genetically almost indistinguishable from its Indo-European speaking Central European neighbors, with only a small genetic trace connecting back to the original Uralic speaking migrants who brought the Hungarian language into the region over 1,000 years ago. In Central Asia, populations speaking Turkic languages, spread across an enormous stretch of territory through a documented historical process, turn out to carry meaningfully different underlying genetic ancestry depending on region, closely tracking geography rather than shared language. Both of those cases involve language spreading across an existing population, largely through cultural transmission rather than large-scale genetic replacement. The Albanian case looks like the same basic pattern, just running in reverse. Instead of one population adopting an incoming language while keeping its own ancestry, in the Balkans, most of the region adopted an incoming Slavic language, while largely keeping its own pre-Slavic ancestry, and one specific community simply never made that particular linguistic switch. It's worth being precise about exactly what makes the Albanian case a genuinely useful comparison point alongside these other examples, rather than simply a similar-sounding story. In the Hungarian case, a small incoming population brought a new language to an already much larger existing population, and that new language spread, while the existing population's genetic ancestry remained dominant. In the Central Asian case, a shared language family spread across an enormous genetically diverse existing population through a documented process of political and cultural influence without a single unified genetic outcome across the whole linguistic zone. The Balkan case adds a third, genuinely distinct variation to this pattern, one where an entire region's population overwhelmingly adopted a new language while keeping its own ancestry, except for one specific community that resisted that particular linguistic shift. Taken together, these three cases show that the relationship between language spread and genetic ancestry can play out in several genuinely different configurations, depending on the specific historical circumstances involved, rather than following one single universal template that applies the same way everywhere researchers happen to look. This finding also sheds genuinely new light on the century-old Illyrian versus Thracian debate mentioned earlier, even if it doesn't fully resolve it. Since genetic ancestry cuts across the entire region relatively evenly, rather than cleanly separating along Old Illyrian versus Thracian territorial lines, the genetic evidence alone can't definitively settle which specific ancient language family modern Albanian actually descends from linguistically. What it can do is confirm that the population speaking Albanian today isn't a genetically separate group that arrived from somewhere else and simply happened to settle in the region at some later date. It's a population deeply rooted in the same broad ancestral Balkan population as its neighbors, carrying forward a language that most of that same regional population eventually stopped speaking, whichever ancient tongue that language ultimately turns out to descend from most directly. Researchers examining this question in more detail have also looked specifically at Y chromosome data across the Balkans, since paternal lineage can sometimes preserve signals that get diluted in broader genome-wide comparisons. A specific Y chromosome lineage, referred to in genetic literature by the code EV13, shows up at unusually high frequency across almost the entire Balkan Peninsula, including Albania, North Macedonia, Serbia, Bosnia, Kosovo, and Greece, with meaningfully lower frequency the further you move away from this specific region. This lineage is generally understood by researchers to reflect a population expansion that occurred in the Balkans well before the Slavic migrations arrived, likely connected to Bronze Age or Iron Age population growth across the region, predating the linguistic changes that came many centuries later. Its consistently high frequency across essentially the entire Balkan peninsula, regardless of which modern language a specific community happens to speak, is itself further genetic evidence supporting the same basic conclusion emerging from the broader genome-wide research that the Balkans share a deep common ancestral population base considerably older than the linguistic boundaries currently dividing the region. Researchers have also used genetic dating techniques to estimate roughly when this specific Y chromosome lineage began its rapid expansion across the Balkans, and the estimates generally point toward a period several thousand years before the Slavic migrations, placing the origin of this particular population growth firmly within the deeper Bronze Age or early Iron Age history of the region, long before any of the specific ancient tribal groups mentioned by later Greek and Roman writers were even recorded in written history. This timing is significant because it means the shared genetic foundation underlying the modern Balkans was already firmly established for thousands of years before either the ancient Illyrian and Thracian tribes documented by classical writers, or as the later Slavic-speaking migrants, entered the picture at all. In a sense, both of those later chapters, the classical era tribes and the medieval Slavic migrations, were playing out on top of an already ancient, already well-established regional population, rather than representing the true starting point of Balkan population history the way a simpler historical narrative might suggest. It's worth being especially careful and precise about what this research does and does not claim, because a finding touching on ethnicity and national identity in a region with as complicated and as sensitive a political history as the Balkans can very easily get pulled in politically charged directions if it isn't communicated with real care. This research does not settle any modern political or national identity questions, and it should not be read, under any circumstances, as making any claim about which modern nation has a stronger or weaker historical claim to any specific territory. Genetic ancestry and modern national identity are two entirely different things, shaped by entirely different historical and political processes, operating on entirely different timescales, and this research speaks only to the first of those, not the second. What the genetic evidence actually shows is a deep, shared ancestral population underlying much of the Balkans, a finding that, if anything, undercuts narratives built around genetic separateness or ethnic purity, since it demonstrates just how thoroughly interconnected the region's deep ancestry actually is, regardless of which specific language, religion, or modern national identity a community happens to carry today. This also has genuine, practical relevance for medical genetics research across the region. Because Balkan populations share such a substantial degree of underlying genetic ancestry, researchers studying inherited genetic conditions across the region have found meaningful overlap in disease, risk patterns across national and linguistic lines, information that has helped shape genetic screening guidance that treats the broader Balkan region as sharing important underlying genetic characteristics, rather than assuming each modern national population represents a fully separate genetic pool requiring entirely separate research from scratch. This shared genetic foundation across the Balkans also means that medical research findings from one national population within the region often translate more directly to neighboring populations than they might in regions where genetic ancestry more closely mirrors modern national borders. Public health researchers working across the Balkans have increasingly taken this into account, recognizing that a genetic screening program developed using data from one Balkan population is likely to remain broadly relevant for a neighboring population as well, even when the two populations speak entirely different languages, practice different religions, and belong to entirely different modern nations, precisely because the deep ancestral population underlying both groups turns out to be so substantially shared once you look past the more recent linguistic, religious, and political history that currently divides them on the surface. Stepping back from all of this, what makes the Albanian case so genuinely compelling is how cleanly it flips the initial assumption on its head. Albanian stands out as one of the sharpest linguistic divides anywhere in Europe, an isolated language surrounded on every side by unrelated Slavic languages. The obvious assumption that this linguistic isolation must reflect an equally sharp genetic isolation turns out to be almost entirely wrong. The population speaking this unique isolated language is, genetically, deeply woven into the same broad ancestral fabric as its Slavic-speaking neighbors, a fabric that stretches back to a shared pre-Slavic Balkan population considerably older than any of the languages currently spoken across the region. It's also worth remembering that this research keeps developing as more communities across the Balkans participate in detailed genetic studies, And as ancient DNA recovered from skeletal remains across the region continues to add direct evidence from the actual populations who lived through this transition rather than relying entirely on inference from modern populations alone. Ancient genomes recovered from pre-Slavic and early Slavic era sites across the Balkans have already begun adding valuable direct evidence to this picture, helping researchers more precisely date exactly when this genetic continuity was established, and clarifying how the more recent historical layers, Roman rule, Byzantine administration, and the Slavic migrations themselves, were layered on top of that much older shared ancestral foundation. Future research along these lines will likely continue refining the details, even as the core finding of surprising genetic continuity underneath one of Europe's sharpest linguistic divides has already held up across multiple independent studies conducted so far. One of the more promising directions for future research involves directly comparing ancient DNA recovered from skeletal remains, dated specifically to the period immediately before and immediately after the Slavic migrations arrived in a given area, since this kind of direct before and after comparison offers a far more precise test of the population continuity hypothesis than comparing modern populations against each other alone ever could. If ancient genomes recovered from sites dated to just before the Slavic migrations closely resemble both modern populations in the same area and ancient genomes recovered from sites dated to just after the migrations arrived, that would provide about as strong a confirmation of population continuity as this kind of research can realistically offer. Several research teams across the region have already begun pursuing exactly this kind of before and after ancient DNA comparison at specific archaeological sites, and the results published so far have generally supported the same basic continuity picture described throughout this video, though researchers are careful to note that additional sites, spread more broadly across the whole region, will be needed before the picture can be considered fully complete. This is ultimately why comparing Albanian DNA against its Balkan neighbors produces a result that genuinely surprises people, expecting language and genetics to move together in a simple, predictable way. The comparison doesn't reveal a genetically isolated population that somehow escaped the historical forces reshaping the rest of the region. It reveals a population that shared deeply in the same regional ancestry as everyone around it, while holding onto a linguistic inheritance that almost everyone else in the region eventually gave up, making Albanian less a story about a separate people and more a story about a single surviving voice from a much older, much more widely shared Balkan past. It's worth putting this finding in perspective against the broader field of European population genetics as a whole, since doing so highlights just how unusual and how genuinely valuable this specific case turned out to be for researchers. Most language versus genetics puzzles studied elsewhere in Europe involve a small incoming population successfully spreading its own language across a much larger existing population, a pattern that, once documented, tends to look broadly similar from one case to the next. The Balkan case runs in the opposite direction, an entire region shifting language while one specific community held the line, which gives researchers a genuinely different kind of test case for understanding exactly how and why language shift does or doesn't happen across a shared ancestral population. Few regions in Europe offer this particular combination: a clearly documented historical migration, a clear surviving linguistic holdout, and a genetic record detailed enough to actually test the relationship between the two directly, which is exactly why the Albanian case has become such a valuable and closely studied example within the broader field. If this kind of investigation into how language, identity, and deep ancestry can pull apart from each other is exactly the sort of mystery that fascinates you, this channel exists specifically to uncover stories like this one, sitting at the intersection of ancient migration, historical linguistics, and modern genetic science. Subscribe so you don't miss our next investigation, where we trace another population whose DNA tells a story considerably more layered than its language or its modern borders would ever suggest on their own. Another case where the assumption everyone starts with turns out to be the exact thing the evidence ends up overturning. And if your own family history connects to the Balkans, and any of the many languages, religions, or communities scattered across that region, it's worth sitting with just how much shared ancestry likely runs underneath whatever specific identity your family carries today, a genetic inheritance considerably older and considerably more widely shared than any of the borders, languages, or conflicts that have divided the region across the more recent centuries of its history. It's a genuinely humbling thought when you actually sit with it. Communities that have, at various points across the last several centuries, found themselves on opposite sides of wars, border disputes, and deep political divisions, turn out, once you trace their ancestry back far enough using modern genetic tools, to descend overwhelmingly from the same shared regional population, a population that existed thousands of years before any of those more recent conflicts, and long before any of the languages currently spoken across the region had even taken their modern form. None of that shared ancestry erases the real, more recent history that has shaped the region since, the empires, the wars, the very different modern national identities that exist today. But it does offer a useful reminder that the deepest layer of any population's story is usually considerably older and considerably more interconnected with its neighbors than the more recent history sitting on top of it would ever suggest on its own. Tell me in the comments what surprised you most about this one, the sheer size of the linguistic gap separating Albanian from its neighbors, how closely the genetics actually lined up despite that gap, or how this connects to similar language versus genetics mysteries covered elsewhere on this channel. Whatever it was, there's a good chance it says something interesting about how you'd been picturing the relationship between language and ancestry before watching this, since almost everyone goes into a story like this one assuming the two should line up far more neatly than they actually do. I read every comment, and it's usually where the next deep dive comes from. And if you want more of the real, evidence-based story behind the world's most surprising ancestral connections, subscribe now. We're just getting started,